Hello, everyone. Welcome. I opened up the room a little earlier just so we can get everyone in and we can start on time. Um, if you'd like to tell us where you're tuning in from as you're coming in, that would be great. I know we must have people from around the country, if not around the world, so it'd be great to hear where you're tuning in from. And we're still waiting for others to come in. Looks like we have someone from Simsbury, not too far. East Haddam. Bath in the UK, Columbia, Maryland. Hi, Emily. Rochester, New York. And as people are coming in, I will just start off with my introduction. Hi, if you haven't been here before, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for what we have in the US as the book called The Dress Diary, Secrets from a Victorian Woman's Wardrobe. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are very happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. Please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, to the house and museum, of course, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and much more. I'll put in a link in the chat right now so you can look at that at your leisure. Now on to our guests. Our author, Dr. Kate Strasdin, is a fashion historian, museum curator, and lecturer at Falmouth University, where she teaches the history of fashion design, marketing, and photography. Our moderator, Emma Gerstein, is the assistant manager of interpretation at the Mark Twain House and Museum. We encourage you to have a conversation in the chat while Kate and Emma are having their conversation. If you have a specific question, though, please post that directly into our Q&A section. If you put it in the chat, it might get lost. So please post your questions in the Q&A section. Please also note that you can click on captions to see live auto captioning of this event, and I'm actually going to turn that on. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will be putting a link in the chat to purchase the Dress Diary through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guest. So that is all from me. I will turn this over to Kate and Emma. Please enjoy.
All right. Well, welcome everyone, and welcome Kate Strasdin. So let's start off with, can you give us a little bit of an explanation of what this book is about, or the book that the book is about?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. It's really lovely to be chatting. So the book is this amazing object that came into my possession in 2016. It was given to me by an elderly lady who made lace at the same group that I attended. I am a bobbin Honiton lace maker here in the UK. And so she had invited me to come and see the stuff that she had in her apartment that she was downsizing from. And the album that she produced, amongst many other things that day, happened to be this incredible object. And I will show, I'll show everybody, I have it here. So this is what she gave me. It was actually wrapped in brown paper. And so it's a big object that was covered in this bright pink silk. And you can see it's just very fat and full of things, full of what I didn't know at that first moment I saw it. And that was how she presented it to me. So it came from her via a really kind of odd route, which is that when she worked in London in the 1960s, one of her colleagues had purchased that album from just a junk store in Camden, on Camden Market in London, and gave it to her because they worked in a theatre wardrobe and they thought that it would be a useful addition to their collection. And she had it for the rest of her life and had taken it with her on her various house moves and then gave it to me. So yeah, it is this incredible object.
Yeah. And so it's this incredible silk bound, bursting at the seams book. And, you know, we can tell from the title of the book, The Dress Diary, that it's not a typical diary. It's not filled with everyday accounts of life, but it is instead filled with hundreds and hundreds of fabric swatches.
Yes, exactly. And it's kind of calling it a diary is almost a stretch, really, because although it is broadly chronological, in that it starts in 1838 and it runs through to the mid 1870s. That's the date of the last swatches that are stuck in the pages. But the actual writing is very sparse. There's very little. They're very informative captions written above each piece of fabric. So they are. They give you the name of the person. They give you a year. Very occasionally there might be an extra detail about where the garment had been worn, but not very often. And so there is very little in the way of biographical information. And yeah, so it's a kind of sparsely written diary, but nonetheless there ended up being just enough in there to open up the door to finding out about who this woman actually was and what her life kind of looked like, what the shape of that life was.
Yeah, and we were just talking before this about how, you know, publication in the UK versus in the US partially changed the title of the book. And one of the things that is different about the UK title is that it has the name of that woman, Anne Sykes.
Exactly.
And there's, as you mentioned, the writing is very sparse. So can you tell us a bit about what it took to help you discover Anne Sykes, that moment of revelation? Because at the start you had no idea who this belonged to, what it was, any of that.
No. And anybody that's done genealogical research before, it can be frustratingly opaque, you know, trying to get to these kinds of stories can be really difficult. But what I did in the first place was that I decided I had to really transcribe this book right from the beginning. So that was the first task, really, to get an idea of what it consisted of. I had to write out every single caption. And so I kind of took it upon myself in 2016 to start transcribing it. And so for each page, I would write how many pieces of fabric there were on each page, what they consisted of, so whether they were silk or cotton or wool, what the pattern was, and describe the actual fabric, and then each page had all of that detail in it. So it meant that I could start to build up kind of patterns of names, and but what was consistent throughout, or almost universally consistent, was the decision by the keeper to write everything in the third person. So the description of everybody was it was the name and the date. So it might say Fanny Taylor's dress 1843, or it might say Mrs. Gregg's neck ribbon 1850. And there everything was written with this kind of distance. And so really for a long time I thought, well, I'm never going to be able to find who this actually belonged to, because it's just a curiosity. You know, there's nobody's acknowledging, the keeper is not kind of saying, this is my book. But luckily there was just one swatch, and there are over 2,000 swatches in the book, but just above just one of them, she did identify herself, and she had written above this particular floral printed cotton sample, Anne Sykes's dress, May 1840, and then just next to it, kind of going around the corner of the swatch in really tiny handwriting, it says, the first dress I wore in Singapore. And so really that was it. That was that one time where it just allowed the unlocking of the whole thing. because having her name and knowing it was her, I could then kind of backtrack to other sections of the book where there had been a wedding sample of Anne Sykes and Adam Sykes, again written in the third person, that said the year they got married. And so that meant I could then get into the census records and track them down. And that's what happened. And from there on in, it was the kind of network of people that ebbed and flowed in and out of their lives that really formed the basis of this whole book.
And it is a vast network of people, and just finding that one name was just the key to,
Yeah.
I mean, before finding out who she was, did you have any idea of where you were going to start, even with researching it?
Well, so there had been one other clue on one of the other swatches where it had identified this particular, again, little floral silk ribbon, and it said part of the sash worn by Emma Taylor at the Preston Guild, 1842.
Right.
The Preston Guild is I didn't know, but I found out, it's an event that takes place every 20 years in the town of Preston in Lancashire. And it's a kind of guild celebration of textile workers that had been taking place since the Tudor period. And it still happens now. It still happens every 20 years. And so I just had this kind of pin in the map that said, well, maybe it's something to do with Lancashire. And lo and behold, that is where Anne was from. She had grown up in and around the mill towns of Lancashire. So this is really the heart of the textile industry. She's right in the centre of it. And I wonder if maybe that accounts for her choice to create an album of this type, because it was just part of everything that surrounded her.
Yeah. And so can you talk on that, on how it surrounded her, not just physically and geographically, but both the family that she was born into and the family that she married into is just intrinsically tied to that textile industry?
Yeah, exactly. So Anne was born in 1816 in a small town called Accrington, and her dad was a man called James Burton. And he was instrumental, first of all, in some of the pioneering calico printing technologies that were starting to emerge at that time. And then he moved into cotton spinning. And by the late 1820s, he had moved to the town of Tyldesley in Lancashire and was the owner of 4 large cotton mills. He employed over 1,000 factory hands. He was a wealthy man. So Anne was she had grown up in this very comfortable family and with textiles at the heart of it. And of course, this is where the story with the US really connects, because all of the cotton at that time was coming from the southern states of the US, and so it's this kind of bound up with that trade. And that was a really fascinating element for me, that textiles has kind of formed the basis of her family's wealth, but it has that complicated story about, because the abolition movement had taken place in the late 18th century, in the UK, but of course, in the southern states it was still cotton that was being picked by the hands of the enslaved. And so that was a whole part of Anne's story that was really amazing.
There's a quote from chapter 2 that I wrote down because it just sums it up so well. As well as a raw material that represents global trade enterprise, however, the fiber also lies at the heart of great wealth and consequently, great inequality. Like, that's it right there. And I think I had learned it at some point in a history class, but the English abolition law that was passed some 30 years before the Emancipation Proclamation in the US, but they were still importing this cotton harvested by enslaved plantation workers.
And so it was it was a problem, and it was something that certainly Quaker communities were starting to try and challenge and tackle. And there were places, so near where I live in the southwest of England, there were a family called the Clark's family who owned a very big shoe enterprise, and Clark shoes you can still buy all over the UK.
Mom loves them.
Yes, they are. But the Clark family were a Quaker family, and the wife of the then owner of the business, had started up an enterprise of importing free labour cotton via a kind of middleman in the north of England from the US, in a bid to try and encourage people that she knew to only buy free labour cotton. But one of the Times correspondents at the time said it was like bailing out the Atlantic with a spoon. It was a tiny fraction, and trying to find enough free labour at that time was really, really difficult. So it was a small kind of it was a small enterprise, but I think it was part of the conversation that was starting to happen.
It's so interesting where we are in the 21st century, again, in terms of the work behind the textile industry, in terms of fast fashion and sweatshops and like the harsh chemicals being used to produce things. And it's so interesting to know that even back then in the early 19th century, there were people making the argument of it is worth it to pay probably more and probably not be as produced as quickly for ethically produced things. And also in chapter 2, which is largely about this whole issue, there was the capitalistic issue of, oh, well, it would be too expensive to do that. We would have to completely clean out all the machines, get rid of all of the cotton that came from enslaved labor. So we can't do that. There's just such a disconnect, and clearly is not a 21st century unique issue. It started a long time ago.
And I think it makes us realize that what happened, it was as the factory system was really starting to command people's attention more and more, and they were having to, in this country, starting to have to acknowledge the child labor and the cost of that in human terms. That's what forced the change, many of the changes that took place, certainly within the factory system. Of course, what's happened now is we've kind of shoved it to a space that we can't see, and those practices haven't gone away. They've just gone out of the line of sight,
and they've like ramped up. There's brands like, I don't know if it's pronounced Shein or Shine. I've heard it pronounced both ways, but they're dropping completely new collections every single day, selling things for mere dollars where it could not possibly have been produced that cheaply and still be paying someone a living wage in good conditions. There's a new like shopping app called Temu that I'm seeing advertised everywhere that is all about how cheap things are. Get them out of our warehouse.
And I think that's what's really interesting, the parallels that very often I get we were talking about this earlier, the idea that dress somehow is superficial and clothing doesn't matter, and it doesn't impact on the bigger things in life. And actually what I wanted to do with this book is to show that actually, if you look at all of these themes through the lens of dress, it matters hugely as an industry, but also, in manufacturing terms, but also in terms of our self-identification and how we present ourselves to the world. And so I think all of those things that might appear to be different in the 19th century still bear a great relevance to today. And that was what really emerged from all the stories in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I said it before. Each one of us, no matter what, every morning when you wake up, you make a conscious decision of what you put on your body. If it's just, oh, I feel like being comfortable today, or, oh, I want to look nice today. I chose this blouse because I was like, what's the most interesting textile in my wardrobe? Polyester velvet. But I made a conscious decision to put this piece of clothing on my body. It's never just clothing. It's never just fabric.
Exactly. And I think particularly from the perspective of, there is that perception as well of 19th century women being these passive creatures that just kind of let life happen to them. And of course, there was huge oppression for women in the 19th century, but dress was something over which they had a great deal of agency. And I think this is what Anne was doing. I think it was the way that fabric could memorialize the people that you knew, and so you would have the patterns and the colors that would remind you of that person. But it was also a kind of it was their space. They had the control over how they had their garments made, what they could choose to wear with it, all of these things. So dress was kind of power for women in the 19th century, I think, maybe more than we appreciate.
Certainly. And, you know, branching off of that, one of the things that struck me immediately as I first began reading was just how many different contexts you've placed this dress diary in. So we have obviously the hierarchical, did I say that right? That's an awful word to say out loud. That context, we've got material, social, familial, professional, geographical, like the list just goes on of how many different ways you can look at it. So just how much can we really learn from one swatch of fabric when it's placed within a given context? There's just so much.
There really is.
Yeah.
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 I think my intention all along was to hope that I could tell as many stories of as many different people's lives. So what I managed to do was I managed to find about probably 30 or 40 people out of the more than 100 names in the book. And the idea was that if I could identify those people, I could then kind of use them as an anchor to tell a particular story. So for example, one of the women in the book is called Charlotte Dugdale Sykes, and she is Anne's niece. And a lot of the swatches that were associated with her were printed cottons. And it also just so happened that her father, William Sykes, who was Adam's brother, so Anne's brother-in-law, he was a designer in the calico printing industry. And so it made sense that Charlotte's story was also the story of printed cotton. Another of the women in the book, called Hannah Kubra, was one of Anne's bridesmaids at her wedding. And 3 of the swatches associated with her were ones that she wore when she was mourning the death of her mother. And so that chapter was Hannah's story, but also the story of mourning etiquette in the 19th century. And so each woman became kind of associated with a particular kind of theme, social theme of that time and place. And yeah, so many different ways of looking at dress, whether it's shopping or lace making or just, you know, all of life is there really in terms of stories, I hope.
One of the things I found really interesting, I mean, I was just about to bring up the 2 women that you brought up, Charlotte, and then also, I just forgot her name, Hannah. There we go. Yeah. You talk about how a lot of Charlotte's things are from when she was a child. They're light printed cottons that were appropriate for a young girl versus mourning clothing, but also how mourning wear or widow's weeds like changed and sometimes became the more practical choice for older women. There's a lot of you can tell about what stage or station of life someone is at. And then there's transitional stages going from cotton to maybe the silks as you're becoming a young lady. And we were talking about the differences in what colors you might wear. Like a married woman would probably not wear head to toe white as she's running her household.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's really the idea of personalities as well. So I had a real sense of, there was one woman in the book who, when I was writing it, I couldn't find anything about. So it just said Miss Garnet, and a couple of pages feature Miss Garnet in the book, in the album. And all of the swatches that had her name against them were really bright. They were just fabulously vibrant, really bold stripes or
some black
patterns. Yeah, very bold. But I didn't know who she was because there wasn't a helpful, you know, very often you need either a very unusual name or you need some dates to go with it so that you can kind of root them in a particular time and place. So I just kind of resigned myself to the fact that I wouldn't know who she was, but there she was. I had a sense of this colourful character. And then following the book's publication here in the UK, I had an email from a researcher who said, I'm researching her family. I know who she is. She's called Martha Garnet, and she lived in the same village as Anne and Adam in the 1850s and became friendly with her. And she was a very colourful personality. She was really into the arts, and she didn't marry and just was known for being something of a live wire. And that was amazing because I knew that just from looking at the fabrics in the diary.
Yeah.
And so it was great to get that sense of that her personality shone through the pages, even though I didn't know who she was.
Now, you mentioned unique names being a good starting point for research, and we're also talking about bright colors. So one of the things you mentioned very early on in the book is that there's a perception of the Victorian era as very austere and serious and gray. Let's talk about Bridget Ann Peacock.
Bridget Ann Peacock, isn't she brilliant? Yes.
Fabulous name.
By her namesake, she was always going to be bright. And yeah, so she was someone that, luckily, because it's such a unique name, I was able to find her in the records. And a lot of the fabrics associated with Bridget Ann Peacock in the book are all the kind of aniline dyes of the 1850s and early 1860s, those bright, vivid purples that were so fashionable all of a sudden. And that was a great story to tell, because, again, yeah, as you say, that sense of door 19th century figures that we see in contemporary photographs, these kind of unsmiling characters.
Gray, black, brown.
No, they weren't. They were colourful people living colourful lives. And she certainly embraced that kind of that trend for synthetic purples in the 1850s. She's a fashionable woman. She didn't marry until later on. And so arguably, you would have looked at her and said that she would have occupied the role of a traditional spinster type figure. But she clearly wasn't having any of that, and decided that she was just going to live her best life and wear purple. And then in her 50s she married, and I hope happily. She had 2 stepdaughters that lived with her for the rest of her life. And but yeah, right up until then, she had these bright purple dresses, which were, I think, again, I hope, a sign of someone who was just a bolder character.
Well, and something that we know about Mark Twain's family, his wife, Olivia Clemens, she liked to wear purple. And I believe I was showing Kate this exhibit catalog from a past exhibit about clothing. One of the other books that is attributed to belonging to Olivia Clemens is this beautiful purple bustle dress. And that, you know, having this impression of Olivia from letters and journal entries, she seems like, yeah, the kind of woman I would see walking around in a bright purple dress. Now, moving away from bright colors, let's talk about, separate from, you know, a fabulous woman living her best life, let's talk about Margaret Charnock, which I know I was very, very excited about. Who was she to Anne Sykes? Well,
that's one of those great kind of moments in research, which is a sort of a lonely endeavor, because when I found it, I mean, I just found this detail and whooped to myself. But, you know, in my office, absolutely thrilled, no one to tell. But very often that process of research is the back and forth. So many times I would look through the album, I'd be seeing if any names had cropped up anywhere else, or I would be looking at the records, again, the census records for Anne and Adam's household, and just kind of, and there was just one day where I'd obviously looked at the census record for 1861, and this name right at the bottom rang a bell, and I thought, oh, hang on, I have seen that somewhere in the album. So referred back to the album, found this lovely, it's a kind of cotton swatch in brown flowers, went back to the census record and clicked on her name, Margaret Charnock, and she was their cook. She had been with them for 20 years. And so once you find that name in the census records, you can then find the other instances. This is the way that the Ancestry database works, certainly in the UK version. So if you click on her name, it will then give you all of the other instances where she's actually crops up in other records. So then I could kind of track back through her life. And she was brought up on a farm in Lancashire. And then when she came of age in her early teens, I suspect, she will have had to make that decision. Did she either go into domestic service or go to work in the factories? Those were the 2 main roles for young women at that point. based on where she lived. And for whatever reason, she opted for domestic service. And so she started out as a housemaid and worked for a family for a number of years as a housemaid. And this is not like the kind of Downton Abbey scenario where you've got a grand house with many domestic servants. This was likely that this household was small. It was just a husband, wife, and a couple of other members of the household, and she was their only housemaid. So she would have been what was known as a kind of maid of all work and have done lots of different jobs. But then at some point after she'd worked for them for a number of years, she had ambitions. She bettered herself and became a cook, and worked as Anne and Adam's cook for 20 years. And then she married a builder, again, slightly later in life, married a builder and lived the rest of her life in Blackpool in the UK. So that was a brilliant story to find, because these are the women whose voices you don't normally hear. They are the kind of hidden thousands of women who weren't writing their life stories down, and they remain kind of hidden away, really.
Yeah, there are hidden voices, but can you also speak to why we don't have, I mean, this is one swatch, and you said there's over 2,000 in the album, and it's not necessarily from some of her work clothes, but
no, it was
talk
probably
about why
her
that's
kind of
missing from a lot of collections.
Yeah, I think certainly in the UK, when dress collections or when historic dress was starting to be seen as worthy of collecting in those early arts museums in the mid to late 19th century and then into the 20th century, the idea of all of those collections was much like they were doing with ceramics at the time, or silverware or anything else. They were collecting the best. So it was seeing dress as an artistic practice, and that you only collect couture, you collect the best of something. And that working class dress, well, first of all, it would have been worn for much longer and worn until it was perceived to have had no value. Yeah, turned into rags or entered the second-hand market. Yeah, reused, all of those things.
The full value of the fabric.
And so it would never have been deemed important enough to find itself into a collection. And now, of course, the very opposite is true. If anything like that were to come to light, it would be considered a much rarer object and much more likely to be very desirable in a collection. But they just don't in great numbers, sadly. They just, they never made it that far.
And so sort of in a similar vein, one of the things you talk about, and this is also connected back to that the Victorians are very serious and boring, the difference in menswear. I think safe to say that it's an overwhelming majority of the swatches are from women's dresses, ribbons, etc. But there's also quite a lot of Adam's vests and whatnot. And some of those are quite exciting fabrics.
They are. And I think that's probably why they're included. I think his suit cloth would just not have been interesting enough for her to include. So all of those kind of sober colors, the blacks and the dark browns and the dark green blue, she didn't ever bother including any of those, but she does include some of the vests. So they are things like kind of plush plaids, really bright checks, window pane checks. There's a lovely kind of floral black with a pink floral pattern on it that was described as a tie that he wore. And some of her, so one of her brothers, Edward Burton, she had 5 brothers, but only one brother makes it into the album. And I wonder if he was like the snappiest dresser of all of her brothers, and the rest of them were too dull to even consider. So yeah, there's not many swatches of menswear, but I think as and when their vest was suitably colourful, she obviously decided it was worth a swatch of fabric.
Yeah, and still connected to Adam, let's place this dress diary in the geographical scope, because we've talked about the Lancashire connections an awful lot, but it's sort of Anne's marriage to Adam that leads her to what I found the most surprising about this, we go to Singapore with her.
Yes. So Adam was a merchant, and he had worked since he was a young man for a number of different merchant companies around Liverpool, and he was based in Liverpool. And then he was given the job of heading up operations for his company in Singapore. And on the 1st of July, 1840, Anne and Adam sailed on a ship called the Friends, and they left Liverpool and spent 4 months sailing to Singapore. And they arrived there on the 30th of October, 1st of November, in 1840. And they were to live there for the next 7 years of their life. So it was a big portion of their young married life together that they lived in this completely different space. You have this woman who had grown up in the very cold, damp region of England in Lancashire, and finds herself in this place that I guess she could not even have imagined, where the climate is completely unlike anything she'll have ever encountered. There are tiger attacks taking place frequently in the settlement, because at this point the European settlement was beginning to encroach on the jungle, and so tiger attacks were frequent. There was a relatively small European population there at that point, as the merchants were beginning to kind of make their mark in that region. And so she lived there for 7 years and made connections with people around her. And so there are many swatches in the book from that period of her life that come from other merchants' wives or ship captains' wives. There's a few from someone called Miss Grant, who was she was the schoolmistress or the head of a local missionary school there. So there's evidence of all this network of women that she forges friendships with in this very different kind of place.
Yeah, and one of those women happened to be an American, and where Anne's thoughts and experiences are kind of missing from this diary, besides the names, you were able to find out quite a lot about this American woman named Maria.
Yes, exactly. And again, this is where an unusual name really is your friend, the researcher. So there are 17 swatches in the album, all of them printed cottons, and they all had the name Maria Balestia. And it was such an unusual name. And I thought, I'm sure, I'll be able to find something. And lo and behold, Maria Balestia was actually born in Boston, and she was the daughter of Paul Revere. So this amazing kind of connection with that famous American patriot. So she was Paul Revere's daughter, and she married a man called Joseph Balestia, who became the first American consul to Singapore. She had moved to Singapore in the early 1830s, and all of her letters have been digitized by the Massachusetts Historical Society. So this is where we were talking about this earlier. I started to actually really get down to the research for this book in January 2020, with grand plans for traveling to different archives around the north of England, and then all came crashing to a horrible end in March 2020, when I was then teaching from home, doing online homeschooling, which was, anyone that was doing that knows how awful that was. And so this became my escape, really, the research for the book. And luckily, because of the digitization of these letters, it meant that I could read the whole of the correspondence between Maria Balestia and her sister, who was back home in Boston. And that's where I got that sense of what life was like for these women. And I mean, it's safe to say that Maria hated it. She was miserable. It was really, she didn't do well with the climate. She was often struggling with fevers. Very sadly lost their only son. Their only son Revere died in Singapore from a fever. And you get this sense of frustration coming from her sister in some of the letters, where her sister kind of is basically saying, just come back. You're miserable. It's hot. You miss your family. Come home. And then Maria's reply will be also kind of snarky, because she then says, well, I can't just come home. We have no money. And Joseph bought a plantation. And, we can't just come home. But it's not like a text exchange that's happening in a matter of seconds. You know, this is like 3 months. It takes 3 months for the letters to travel back and forth. And so that sense of distance and isolation really came through in Maria's experience. And she died there. I mean, she eventually, one of the fevers that she caught, she succumbed to, and she died out there and never made it back to Boston.
Well, luckily we know that that was not the fate of Anne Sykes.
No.
But upon leaving Singapore, she doesn't go right back to Lancashire. Where does she go next?
She went for 2 years to Shanghai. So in 1847, they left Singapore and went to Shanghai for 2 years. But that's a really interesting part of her life, because she doesn't include any swatches really that relate to that time. There are no swatches from that date. There are sometimes there are a couple of silks that she has labeled China silk, but there are no people there. And I do wonder if she was very happy there, and that was a period of her life that she didn't particularly enjoy, and therefore didn't record it in her album. And then in 1849 she moved back to Lancashire with Adam, and they spent the rest of their life living in different places around Lancashire and the county of their birth. And so I was able to then follow them through their different homes and the people that they encountered there as well.
And then eventually, this is how the book ends, you were able to actually go there, and you walked the path you realized that they would have walked at their wedding. Tell me about that experience, because that again gave me absolute chills reading through it.
That was so brilliant, because so much of the book had been undertaken through various lockdowns. And then in January 2021, the book was going to the publisher. The draft was being submitted in April 21. And I thought, I really want to feel like the final part of this journey before I hand the draft to the publisher is for me to feel that I have actually been there. It would feel odd not to. So in the January, very kind of cold, wet January 2021, drove up to Lancashire, and I had a series of places that I wanted to visit. So the first place we visited was St George's Church in Tyldesley, which is where Anne and Adam got married. And I was able to see that the street that Anne lived on, which was a street called Factory Street, although the buildings are no longer there, none of the mill buildings or the house that she grew up in, Burton House, but Factory Street is still there, and it's a kind of modern properties now. But I could see that it was just a 2-minute walk. And so I walked from Factory Street up the church path, along the path that she would have walked along with Adam on her wedding day. Then I visited Clitheroe and one of the mills that's being renovated at the moment, and it's the Primrose Printworks, which was one of the calico printworks that she mentions in the book. We stayed at the Imperial Hotel in Blackpool because on the 1871 census, that's where we find Anne and Adam. They were there. I don't know if they were there for a kind of seaside break or if they were there house hunting, because they were kind of on the move again. I also visited Colthurst Hall, which is one of the properties that they lived in for over 20 years. They rented it, and we found it, and it was this beautiful detached property. My husband said, okay, just take a picture of the house and then we're going to go. Could I not just knock on the door?
All this way.
We came all this way. I could just knock on the door, rolling his eyes with the engine running. Anyway, I did knock on the door, and I did have this lovely, so the lady, the owner of the house, showed us around the house, and lots of the original features are still there. And what was great was there's a swatch of fabric in the book that says drawing room furniture at Colthurst. And so the drawing room is still there, and it's still got all of its wood paneling. And I could just imagine this rose printed chintz fabric that she had chosen for the furniture. And then finally we made it to Bispham. the last years of their life, they lived in a very large detached house because Adam had made a lot of money as a merchant. So when Anne died, her will was, her estate was valued at £31,000, which amounts to over 4 million today. So she died a very wealthy woman. But they lived in a place called the Knoll at Bispham, which is just north of Blackpool. And although that house doesn't survive anymore, the churchyard where both Anne and Adam are buried still does. And so the kind of final act really was to find their headstone in the churchyard, which is this beautiful Celtic cross, very ornate carved Celtic cross. And that's where I kind of found her. And it was the first time, having spent so much time finding her in different ways and kind of imagining her dresses and her life, and I kind of finally found her, and that was great.
Did you cry? I would have cried.
I did feel quite emotional. It was raining and it was January, and I was kind of, but I had bought a little plant with me, and I planted it at the bottom of the headstone, just because it had felt, I'd never imagined that I would be able to find out so much about her life. And there she was, you know, it was, I kind of, I wanted to say thank you to her for being able to take this route and the object that she created.
Just, it absolutely blows my mind, this entire saga. I mean, when Omar was planning out these book talks and he mentioned that he needed someone to moderate this, I heard the premise of the book and I said, oh my God, that is incredible. And it all came from, I believe you said, a friendship that you made through your lace making group.
Yes, yeah. Just an elderly lady.
Like this.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's all about female networks and friendships, and yeah, so it had these kind of parallels that ran alongside all the way through.
Yeah, it's incredible. And thank you for sharing all of that with us. And I think it is about time to check back in with Omar, because I think we are going to do a brief Q&A to tie things off.
Yes, it looks like we do have a few questions. Let's see here. And also comments. Let me start off with the comments. Dress offers such an insight into the lives of women, and this woman in particular, says Andrea. And also, Sharon says, thank you for this book and your presentation. I'm very anxious to read this fascinating story. Oh, and then Sharon also said earlier, my maternal grandmother traveled to America from Sweden. She was an excellent tailor and seamstress and was hired by a family in Connecticut. She taught me to sew when I was 11 years old. I've used this skill all my life. It is so valuable to me. I have a bin of some of her fabrics.
Oh, that's so lovely.
I literally say, like, people talk about inheritances. This is my inheritance. My Nana taught me how to sew. I am using her sewing machine to this day. Like, it's one of those things where you talk about it in the book quite a lot. If the skills are not passed down, everything's automated, that's an entire network and a heritage that will be lost.
Yeah, so exactly. And I think fabric itself, I mean, saying about you have the bin full of those fabrics, I'm sure that it's a bit like my grandmother's button tin that I inherited, and she could tell me where those buttons came from and what garments they belong to, and they invoke memories. And so I think that that's really powerful.
Absolutely. Andy asks, why do you think she decided to keep the diary in the first place? And did she take it to Singapore and other travels? I think you answered that.
I think she did take it with her, definitely, because it's full of the swatches from different people. I think the reason that she kept it for her, it's almost like an autograph album. So I think it's her way of remembering the people that she has met through her life. And sometimes there are pages and pages. Obviously, there are some people that feature throughout her life, family members who crop up across the extent of the whole volume. And then there are other people that maybe just have one page, and that idea that, you know, sometimes we meet people we really like, but we don't meet them for very long. You know, they're not part of our lives necessarily for a long time. And so I think it was her way of just remembering people, and you can remember people through cloth, through what they wear. They, you know, very often that is a very powerful association.
Absolutely. Linda asks, would these swatches have been acquired from articles of clothing that the owner had worn in her presence, from discarded items, or from the fabric used to make new items? And if the swatches came from clothing still being worn, how would they have been cut from the garment while leaving it wearable?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think often there is that sense that, you know, you have this this woman chasing people down with scissors and kind of snipping cloth from them unbeknown to them. This is very much the period where women are buying cloth. So you buy cloth from a draper or a haberdasher or a warehouse, and then you take that bolt of fabric to your dressmaker. And there are many, many thousands of dressmakers at that point in every town and village, working at different price points. But you would take your fabric to the dressmaker. There would be that kind of back and forth conversation about what you wanted to have made. And then inevitably there would be scraps left over at the end. So when you collected your garment, you would also collect, because you owned the fabric, you would also collect the scraps of fabric that were left. And so I think that's how, once people knew what Anne was actually up to with her album, she would request that when they had a new garment made, that perhaps she could have a scrap that was left over. So yeah, I think they're new garments primarily, that she was acquiring the little pieces from.
And Maite asks, will all the pages, will the dress diary pages will they be available online at some point?
Yes, I would very much like to do that. So my intention at the moment, there are colour plates in the book, but they really only represent a fraction of the whole. And what I would like to do, I don't feel at all precious about, you know, sharing the contents. And so what I would like to do is gradually digitize the book. So I might do it on Instagram in the first instance, where I create a kind of a highlights
Digital
section.
diary.
Yeah, digital diary, exactly. But I would like to set up to have a website so that people can access and see each of the pages and all of the different names and fabrics, and because I'm sure people will bring their own insights. There's so many different fabrics and unusual constructions and weaves that I don't always, you know, I don't know about, and I would love to hear other people's thoughts. So yes, definitely I would like to do that.
I was so excited by the QR code at the end to see a couple more.
Yeah, there's a few more visible at the end of the book. Yeah.
We've gotten a few more questions. Maite says a digitized diary would be a great research tool. Yes, indeed.
It could be its own Instagram, just
Yes.
the dress diary.
It could just of its own, on its own.
Absolutely. I know. So I imagine some of us have gone to the V&A's online collection to look at those beautiful pieces. Annette asks, please describe the fabric in Anne's wedding dress.
Yeah, so there's a page devoted to their wedding. The dress that she wore to the actual ceremony is a kind of window pane check cotton, white cotton. That was for the church part. Alongside that is a piece of silk from Adam's vest, which was a cream silk satin with a sort of trailing fine floral self-colored pattern. Then there's a little snip of the lace that trimmed the dress, which is a kind of a bobbin lace. And then at the bottom, there's a sort of champagne colored satin, which was the dress. It's labeled that was the dress that Anne wore to the wedding breakfast afterwards. So yeah, white pure white window pane cotton, and then satin for later on.
Wonderful. I'll actually sneak in an anecdote. Since we're talking about wedding dresses, I visited our museum friends at the Connecticut Historical Society, that is very close to the Mark Twain House, and took a behind-the-scenes tour of their textiles collection, focused on their 1920s textiles. And a lot of people had questions about what kind of clothes are the most commonly collected by museums, and wedding dresses, of course, were the number one, because of course people keep those over their daily clothes. And I also asked a question about which clothes from which time period they're looking to collect at this time, and they said 1980s and 90s. So
Oh, really? Oh, when my students say that they like vintage clothes, and then they say the 90s, and it just makes my heart go
I
cold.
know, yeah. Joan asks, did Anne herself sew?
That's a really good question. I don't know, because she doesn't actually write anything about herself. It's very difficult to know to know whether or not she did. I suspect she would have been very good, like most women in her kind of place in life. I expect she would have been very good at things like mending. She would have learned how to darn really well. And there are a couple of swatches in the book that are like a kind of very fine cotton, and then there's a small hand embroidered motifs in that chain stitch, in that kind of process that was very popular at that time, tambour work. And so that could have been Anne herself who has embellished that particular garment, but she doesn't write about it, and so it's difficult to know. But I suspect she would have been able to do all of those things that most women in her space would have done.
And it looks like we've run out of questions, but we do have a couple minutes. So if you do have any questions.
I have a question for you, Kate.
Yes.
If you had to pick just one, we could even say one page, what is your favorite page or swatch from the diary, and why?
I think apart from the one where Anne identified herself, because that, without it would have been impossible. I think it's the pirate flag. We didn't talk about the pirates, but
we got to the tiger attacks, and I thought we might.
Tiger attacks. And I think it's because it's such a brilliant, this page that has, so at the top of this page, it's just a red piece of very moth-eaten wool.
And that is in the color plates, I believe. It
is in the color plates. So it's a red, it's a piece of red flannel, and it looks very ordinary until you read the caption above it. There it is. And it says, part of the pirate flag taken in Borneo by the Admiral, 1845. And it was just like, this is wild. What's this doing here? And it transpired that the Admiral in question was someone called Admiral Sir Thomas Cochrane, who was, he was in the region at that time on anti-piracy duty. So the British Navy had sent him out there on board HMS Agincourt to deal with the Malay pirates had cottoned on to the fact that merchant vessels were really lucrative and worth plundering. The kind of really awful thing about it being a red flag, as I discovered through my research, was that red in the kind of pirate code meant no quarter given, so there will be no mercy shown. So if you see a red pirate flag, it's a pretty horrifying thing. But what I also love about that page is that just below the pirate flag, you've got this piece of blue velvet at the bottom that says Adam's birthday slippers, 1846. And it's just like international piracy, bedroom slippers on the same page. And it just summed up for me the whole scope of the world that seemed to be present in the album.
He's in this like incredibly bustling colonial import export, and then also she's still living her life in her
bedroom slippers. Exactly. Life went on.
Oh my goodness. And speaking of life moving on, are there any descendants of Anne alive today?
Anne and Adam never had any children, and so there's no direct line. but she did have many brothers. And I'm sure that because my research was, I was kind of being channeled towards publication, and so I had to, there were times where I couldn't tarry for too long on certain subjects, but I'm sure if I revisited that, so the Burton family, her brothers, I'm sure there must be, as I am sure there must be a photograph of Anne, because she's absolutely living at that period where somebody in her position in life would undoubtedly have had her photograph taken. You know, in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. So I'm sure there must be a photograph, but I expect it's in some kind of, maybe in some family album where they don't really quite know who this person is. And that's the kind of odd thing. I know everything about her in many ways. I know what she wore on at any given time. I know what colors she liked. I know what neck ribbons she bought, but I don't know what she looked like. And that remains the kind of mystery.
Waiting to be discovered.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, we will end it there. Thank you so much, Kate. This was really wonderful, and thank you, Emma, for moderating. This is your first
Thank
time.
you.
You
Yay,
did
you did a
awesome.
great job. Thank you.
I had a great time.
Yes. And thank you to all of our viewers for joining us today. Please join us at the museum for a tour. We're open every day. Check our website for more information on our hours. You can also visit our brand new exhibit for business or pleasure, Twain Summer Sojourns, which focuses on the Clemens family's American summer vacations between 1870 and 1910.
And has some interesting clothes in it as well.
Yes, it does. So please come and see them. Thanks again, and please join us again.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day or evening wherever you are.